I need to tell you that I'm not someone who does things like this. I am not someone who hires investigators or files injunctions, or sits in a law office at 9 in the morning with a folder of evidence and shaking hands. I am a dental hygienist from Columbus, Ohio. My biggest drama before all of this was arguing with my neighbor about his recycling bins. I want you to hold that picture of me in your head. Because the person I became over the next 3 years, the person who sat across a conference table from my sister and watched her cry and felt absolutely nothing. That person surprised even me. I'm going to tell you about my mother, Diane, about what happened to her in the last 18 months of her life, when she was sick and confused and didn't always know what day it was or what she was signing. About what my sister Renee and her husband Craig did during those 18 months. About what I found in a filing cabinet in the basement of my mother's house the week after we buried her. About a signature that wasn't my mother's, or maybe it was. That's the part that still keeps me up at night. Asterisk, like, and subscribe the channel and tell us in comments from where are you watching this episode asterisk. My name is Nora, and I have been sitting on this story for 2 years. I told myself I was waiting until the legal stuff was over. Then I told myself I was waiting until I felt ready. But I don't think I'm ever going to feel ready. So here it is. Asterisk, I grew up in a house that smelled like lemon dish soap and fabric softener. It's such a small detail, and I know that, but it's the first thing that comes to me when I think about being a child. That smell. And the way afternoon light came through the kitchen window at about 3:30 and turned the whole room gold. My mother, Diane Carol Hutchins, was born in 1951 in Morgantown, West Virginia, the third of 4 children. And she moved to Columbus in 1973 when she married my father, Robert. They bought the house on Grayfield Lane in 1978 with money they'd been saving for 3 years. My mother used to say that the first morning she woke up in that house, she lay in bed and looked at the ceiling and thought, this is mine. Not ours. Mine. I think that's important, who she was. She was a woman who understood ownership, who understood what it meant to work for something, to earn it, to hold it. Asterisk, my father died in 2009. Heart attack, very sudden, no warning. He was 61 years old and he'd been planning to retire in the spring, and then one Tuesday in November he was gone. I remember my mother calling me. I was 28, living in an apartment in Clintonville, and she just said, Nora, your dad. That was it. Those 2 words, and I already knew, after my father died, my mother could have fallen apart. Some people do, after 40 years with someone. They lose the shape of themselves. But my mother, she grieved the way she did everything, which was thoroughly and with her whole chest. And then she got up and she figured out what her life looked like now. She took a part-time job at the public library, shelving books 3 mornings a week. She joined a walking group. She replanted the entire backyard garden, which had been my dad's territory, and made it completely her own, all perennials, she used to say, because she wanted things that came back. Asterisk, she was, by every measure I had, completely fine. Not happy in the way she'd been happy with my dad, but fine in the deeper sense, stable, rooted, present. I need you to understand who she was before I tell you what happened to her. I need you to understand that she was sharp. She was funny in that dry, quiet way where you'd be in the middle of a conversation, and she'd say something so perfectly observed that you'd stop and just look at her. She could do the New York Times crossword puzzle, the Friday one, in pen. She remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every detail you'd mentioned in passing 6 months ago. She was not a woman you could fool easily. That's why what happened is so hard to explain. Because I've asked myself 1,000 times how someone that sharp could end up in this situation. And the only answer I've come up with is that the people doing it were people she trusted completely. People she loved? Which, if you think about it, is the only way any of this ever works. Asterisk, I have an older sister. Her name is Renee. She's 4 years older than me, which made her 36 to my 32 when my dad died. And she and her husband Craig had moved back to Columbus from Chicago about a year before that. Craig had taken a job at an insurance company and they'd bought a house about 12 minutes from my mother's, growing up. Renee and I were not especially close, but we weren't enemies either. We were just different. She was the organized one, the older one, the one who'd been given more responsibility and had grown to need it like oxygen. She was the type of person who managed things, who took charge in a way that could feel like love or control depending on the day. And sometimes it was genuinely hard to tell the difference. After my dad died, Renee stepped into the role of family manager in a way that felt, at the time, like grace. She handled the funeral arrangements. She dealt with the estate attorney. She made sure my mother ate in those first blurred weeks. I was grateful. I said it. I meant it. Asterisk, I just didn't see yet how those habits compound over time. My mother's house on Grayfield Lane was a 3-bedroom ranch. Nothing fancy, the kind of house that had been added to and modified over 4 decades so that it had this particular lived-in personality. A sunroom my dad built in 1992. A kitchen that had been remodeled once, but still had the original linoleum beneath the new tile. A basement that held 40 years of Christmas decorations and my mother's collection of mystery novels and matching cardboard boxes. Organized by author. The house was worth, when my mother was alive and well and managing her own affairs, somewhere between $210,000 and $230,000 depending on the market. Not life-changing money. Not nothing either. Especially given that she had a small retirement account, a few CDs at Huntington Bank, some jewelry that had been her own mother's. Her total estate was probably in the range of $350,000. Maybe a little more. I'm telling you the numbers because the numbers matter. Because in stories like this, the numbers are always part of the story. She had a will. She'd made it in 2011, 2 years after my dad died, with an attorney named Gerald Pitts whose office was on 5th Avenue downtown. In it, she left the house, her retirement accounts, and the contents of her home equally to Renee and me, 50-50. She'd told us both about it, separately in that straightforward way she had. I wanted you both to know, she said to me over the phone. I didn't want there to be any surprises. There were surprises anyway. Just not from her. Asterisk from 2009 to 2016. My life had the particular shape of someone who is, by all external metrics, doing fine. I had my dental hygiene job at a practice in Upper Arlington, good hours, good pay for the work, a staff I genuinely liked. I had a boyfriend, Marcus, who was kind and steady and not quite right for me in a way. I chose not to examine too closely because the stability felt good. I had friends. I went to yoga twice a week. I drove to my mother's for Sunday dinner most weeks. Sometimes every other week if life got in the way. My mother and I talked on the phone at least 3 times a week. That was our thing. She'd call while she was walking, and I'd be on my lunch break. Or I'd call her on my drive home and we'd talk until I got in my front door. About nothing. About everything. About the book she was reading. About a patient who'd done something funny. About what she'd planted in the garden. About some stories she'd heard at the library. Asterisk, we were close in that quiet, woven in way that some mothers and daughters have, where you don't necessarily feel it because it's always there. The way you don't notice the floor until you're afraid you might lose it. Renee and Craig, during those years, were around, present. They had 2 kids by then. Mason, born in 2008, and Lily, born in 2011, and their lives had the full, chaotic texture of a family with small children. So I didn't think much about how often they were over at my mother's. It made sense. My mother adored those kids. She babysat. She fed them. She taught Lily to do a French braid. She taught Mason to play checkers. Craig Stafford. I should tell you about Craig, because understanding him is part of understanding how this worked. He was a medium-tall man with sandy brown hair going gray at the temples. The kind of face that was pleasant without being memorable, and a manner that was warm in a way that was, I would come to understand, very precisely calculated. He sold insurance. Not in a metaphorical way, though I've thought of that metaphor many times since. He literally sold insurance. And he was apparently excellent at it. Because he'd made director by his mid-30s and drove a company. Lease on an Audi and wore the slightly too good suits that men in that industry wear. Asterisk, he was charming in a low-key way. He remembered things you said. He asked follow-up questions.
He made my mother feel heard, which, for a widow, is not a small thing, looking back.
I think I just thought he was a nice guy. My brother-in-law. The father of my niece and nephew. The person my sister had chosen. I didn't wonder then why he was so interested in my mother's financial affairs. He'd been helping her file her taxes since 2012, which she'd asked him to do because my dad had always done them and she didn't know how. He'd gone with her to meet with her financial advisor. He'd helped her refinance a small home equity line of credit she'd taken out to fix the roof. Asterisk, it was help. It looked like help. I receive it now for what it actually was, reconnaissance, but that's the thing about predatory behavior within families. It doesn't announce itself. It fills the exact shape of love. It does what love does, shows up, offers assistance, makes itself necessary, and then it waits. Renee during these years was... Renee, I want to be careful here because I know she is a complicated person, and I was not always fair to her. And the full picture includes things I did wrong too. But this is what I can say honestly, she had always wanted, more than I understood, to be our mother's favorite. Not in a petty way, or not only in a petty way. In the deep, old way that some firstborn children carry a wound they can't quite name. The sense that they worked the hardest and weren't appreciated enough. That they showed up most and got the least. Asterisk, I don't know if that's true in any objective sense. I know my mother loved us both. I know she showed it differently to different people at different times. I know Renee felt overlooked in ways I probably didn't fully register because I was the younger one and had a different experience. What I should have paid more attention to was how that wound, over time, had calcified into something harder. Into a need to control. Into the particular way Renee had of talking about our mother in her presence, with this affectionate, faintly condescending tone. As if she were a child who needed managing rather than a competent woman who needed nothing of the sort. Mom, you know you don't need to do all that yourself, she'd say. About things my mother was perfectly capable of doing herself. Asterisk, or, we should probably think about getting someone to help with the yard. Mom, you can't be out in the heat like that at your age. My mother was 64 years old in 2016. She was doing yoga. She was gardening. She was fine, but I let Renee be the family manager and I let Craig be the financial helper, and I went home to my apartment and my almost right boyfriend and my twice-weekly yoga, and I trusted that what I was seeing was what it appeared to be. I was wrong. But I wouldn't know that for another 2 years. Asterisk, it started in the spring of 2018. And even now, trying to pinpoint the exact moment I first felt it, that bristle on the back of the neck. That sense that something in the room has changed even though everything looks the same. I land on a Sunday in April. I'd driven over for dinner. My mother had made her chicken soup, the one she'd been making since I was a child. The one she made from the carcass of whatever roast chicken she'd had the previous weekend. The house smelled right. The table was set. Everything was familiar, but when I got there, Renee was already in the kitchen with my mother, and she was going through the drawer. You know how every house has that one drawer? The miscellaneous drawer, the everything drawer, the drawer where you put things that don't have a better place yet? My mother's was in the kitchen, second drawer to the right of the sink. It had always held pens, rubber bands, takeout menus, the occasional coupon, a small flashlight, the address book she'd had since the 1980 South. Renee was going through it, methodically, pulling things out, putting them in a small pile. What are you doing? I asked. She looked up, not surprised to see me, which meant she'd known I was coming and had decided not to wait for me before doing this. Mom can't find her a card, she said. We're looking. Asterisk, my mother was at the stove, stirring the soup. She didn't look troubled. She gave me a little wave over her shoulder. Did you try your wallet, Mom? I said, I already looked in my wallet, my mother said. I'll handle it, Renee said. Not sharp? Just firm. The way she always said it. I'll handle it, I stood there for a moment with my coat still on, watching Renee go through my mother's drawer, and something moved through me that I couldn't name right away. Later, driving home, I decided it was unease. The way you feel when something is 2 degrees off from normal, and you can't quite identify the 2 degrees. Asterisk, I didn't say anything. I took off my coat and helped set the table. That was my first mistake. The not saying anything. I made it many times after that. Over the following months, I started noticing things. Small things. The kind that individually are nothing. And together are a picture. My mother stopped being the one to answer questions about her own finances. In July, I asked her offhandedly what her plans were for the vacation week in August. She'd been talking about going to visit a friend in Asheville, and she said, "Renee thinks maybe I should stay close this summer." I've decided not to go. Renee thinks. In August. I called on a Tuesday afternoon and my mother didn't pick up. She called back 40 minutes later, which was unusual. She always had her phone. "Oh, Craig and Renee were over," she said. I left my phone in the bedroom. Asterisk, everything okay? Of course. They were just helping me with some paperwork. What kind of paperwork? Small pause. Oh, just insurance things. In September, I came for her birthday dinner. 67 years old. I'd bought her a cashmere sweater in the soft green she loved and a book I'd been saving for her. When I got there, Craig was at the kitchen table with my mother's financial statements spread out in front of him.
He looked up when I came in and smiled, warm, easy.
Unhurried, and began gathering them up. "Just helping Diane get organized," he said. "I didn't know you were coming," I said. "Oh." We were in the neighborhood, Renee called from the living room. "Figured we'd pop by." I looked at my mother. She was smiling. She seemed fine. She seemed normal. But she also didn't meet my eyes, and my mother always met my eyes. That's the detail I keep coming back to. The eyes. Asterisk, I started keeping notes in October 2018, not formal notes. I didn't know yet that I'd need formal notes. Just a running note in my phone's memo app. A habit I picked up from years of noting things for patients. Dates, observations, what I'd seen or heard. October 3rd. Mom mentioned she's been having some headaches. Says they come and go. October 14th. Renee called to say she's keeping a closer eye on Mom and that I should call before coming over so we don't overlap. Why would it matter if we overlap? October 22nd. Mom's address book is gone from the kitchen drawer. She says she doesn't know where it is. November 7th. Called Mom at 10 a.m. Craig answered. Sighed. Mom was resting. She called back at 4 p.m. Sounded tired. Said she'd had a procedure at the doctor's routine, she said, but didn't say what. I can feel. Writing this now, the particular helplessness of that period. The sense that something was moving and I couldn't see its full shape. Couldn't put my hands on it, couldn't name it clearly enough to say to anyone, "This is wrong. Help me. Something is wrong," because what would I have said? My sister goes through my mother's drawer? My brother-in-law is over a lot? My mother sounds tired? I said it once to Marcus and he said, "She's 67, Nora. She's getting older. It's natural for Renee to take on more." And I know he meant it kindly, but I also know that he'd never watch someone slowly and gently be rerouted from themselves. I kept making notes. December 4th. Mom asked me if I knew where the yellow folder was. I didn't. She said Craig had been keeping some of her files in order, and she couldn't find the yellow folder. She didn't seem alarmed. I was alarmed enough for both of us. In January 2019. My mother told me on the phone that she'd had some memory problems. Small ones, she said. Just forgetting words sometimes. Losing track of where she'd put things. The doctor was running some tests. I asked what the doctor's name was. There was a pause. "Dr. Moran," she said. "He's new?" Renee found him. Asterisk, in March 2019, my mother was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. That was the official term, mild. The doctor, Dr. Moran, who I eventually learned was not a neurologist but a general practitioner in Renee and Craig's insurance network, used that word as if it were reassuring. It's not Alzheimer's. Renee told me on the phone, with a tone that was somehow both alarmed and brisk, both maternal and businesslike. But she does need more help. She needs someone keeping an eye on things. She needs us, I said. Both of us. Of course, Renee said. That's exactly what I'm saying. But it wasn't, quite. What happened next was that Renee began scheduling what she called check-ins at my mother's house, multiple times a week. She took my mother to all her appointments. She volunteered to handle my mother's bills. Which my mother, maybe because she was frightened. Maybe because the diagnosis had shaken her sense of herself. Maybe because Renee had spent years making herself the person you turned to, agreed to, I was excluded from this process in ways that were so politely framed. I couldn't object to any specific instance. Oh, I didn't want to bother you with this. You've got your work and everything. I figured I'd just handle it. Mom was tired that day. It wasn't a good day for visitors. I pushed back. I said I wanted to be included. I said I wanted to see the doctor's reports. Renee sent me a summary, 2 paragraphs, her own words, not the actual report. I asked for the actual report. She said she'd look into whether that was something she could share. She never followed up. I called my mother's doctor directly and was told that Renee Stafford had medical power of attorney. I didn't know that. My mother hadn't told me. And when I asked my mother about it, she said, with that particular vagueness that was becoming more frequent, "Oh, Renee helped me set that up." She said it was important. I don't know when it happened. I've thought about it a lot. I think it happened sometime in late 2018. Before the formal diagnosis, when my mother was beginning to be confused sometimes but was not yet clearly impaired. When she was still, to anyone watching, a woman making reasonable choices. That's the window. That's the gap between who she had been and who she was becoming. And that gap is where Renee and Craig did most of their work. In April 2019. I drove to my mother's house on a Saturday morning unannounced. I know I had been told to call ahead. I chose not to. My mother answered the door in her robe, which was unusual for 10 in the morning. She'd always been up and dressed by 8. She looked surprised to see me but not displeased. She looked, I thought, a little relieved. We had coffee. We talked. She was mostly herself that morning, sharp about some things, vague about others. She asked me twice what day it was, which she'd never done before, and then she said, out of nowhere, "Nora, do you know about the yellow folder?" I told her I remembered she'd mentioned it. She set down her coffee cup. She looked at me with the directness she'd always had, before the confusion set in, that exact look she used to give me when I was a child and she needed me to pay attention. "I can't find it," she said. "I've looked and looked. It had things in it. Important things. Your father's letters. Some papers." "What kind of papers?" She shook her head, pressed her fingers to her temple. "I don't remember exactly. But I remember putting it in the filing cabinet and now it's not there." "Which filing cabinet?" "In the basement. The gray one your father had." I went downstairs that day. I don't know if my mother asked me to or if I just decided to go. The basement had that particular smell of old houses, dust and the faint mineral smell of the concrete walls. And under it faintly, the cedar of an old wardrobe my parents had kept down there since 1985. The gray filing cabinet was in the corner. 3 drawers. The top drawer held my father's old work files, going back 20 years, undisturbed as far as I could tell. The second drawer held household records, appliance manuals, receipts, insurance documents. The bottom drawer was mostly empty. Not completely. There were a few folders in it, pushed to the back. But there was also a clear gap, a gap where folders had been and weren't anymore. The hanging files had been pushed together. But you could see the marks in the dust where a group of folders had been pulled out. I don't know who took them, but I know that the last person who'd been in that basement that I knew of was Craig. He'd helped my mother clean out some old paperwork in December. She'd mentioned it. She'd said Craig was helping her get organized. I took out my phone. I photographed the drawer. I photographed the gap in the files. I wrote down the date. Then I went back upstairs and sat with my mother for another 2 hours. And when I left, I hugged her for a long time, and she said, "Come back soon, And I said I would, and I did. As often as they'd let me. In May 2019, I contacted Gerald Pitts, my mother's attorney, the one who'd drawn up the 2011 will. I didn't know what I was going to say. I called from my car in the parking lot of the dental practice between patients. On a Thursday afternoon. His receptionist told me that Mr. Pitts had retired in 2017. His practice had been absorbed by another firm. I asked if they had my mother's files. I was told they might, but that files belonging to a living client would require authorization from the client or their authorized representative. Their authorized representative, Renee. I then did what I should have done immediately. But what took me 3 weeks to get around to, because I kept hoping there was an innocent explanation. Which is the thing that family does to you. Hope keeps you slow. I called a different attorney. One I found by asking a colleague at work who asked her cousin, who recommended a woman named Patricia Okafor who specialized in elder law and estate disputes. With an office in Westerville, I explained the situation to Patricia in a phone call that lasted 27 minutes. I told her about the medical power of attorney, about the yellow folder, about the gap in the filing cabinet, about being excluded from my mother's appointments, about Craig's access to my mother's finances. There was a pause on the line. Has your mother's will been modified since 2011? Patricia asked. I don't know, I said. I don't have access to her current documents. Does your mother have a financial power of attorney in addition to the medical one? I don't know. Has anyone discussed the possibility of guardianship? No. Another pause, shorter this time. Nora, Patricia said, I want you to hear me clearly. I am not saying anything illegal has occurred. What I'm saying is that the pattern you're describing is consistent with patterns I see in cases of undue influence and financial exploitation of cognitively impaired adults. That doesn't mean that's what this is. But I think you should come see me. I went the following Tuesday. Meanwhile, I was still trying to reach my mother. In May, I called 4 times in 1 week and got Craig each time, or got voicemail. My mother called back inconsistently, sometimes within the hour, sometimes the next day, sometimes not at all. When she did call back, she was sometimes sharp and present, and sometimes distant in a way that scared me. I went to the house 3 times without calling. The first time, my mother answered and let me in, and we had a good afternoon. The second time, Renee was there and was polite in a way that was distinctly unfriendly, and my mother seemed confused in a way she hadn't been 2 days before. The third time, I knocked and no one answered even though I could see my mother's car in the driveway and there was movement behind the curtains. Standing on the porch of the house I grew up in, knocking on the door, knowing she was inside, not being let in, I sat in my car for a while after. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there and thought, this is a decision someone has made. Someone has decided that I'm a problem. And that told me more than anything else that there was, in fact, a problem. I called Renee that night. She wasn't home when I stopped by, I said. She might have been resting, Renee said. She has good days and bad days. Renee, I could see the curtains moving. A pause. Nora, I know this is hard. It's hard for me too. I'm there every day. You're not. I'm not there because you've made it. I haven't made anything. You're welcome anytime. I just ask that you call first because it upsets her when routines get disrupted. The doctor says, which doctor? Dr. Moran. He says, Renee, I want to see the neurologist's report. She hasn't been to a neurologist yet. I've been trying to get a referral. You've had power of attorney for 4 months. You haven't gotten a neurologist referral. It's a process, Renee said. And her voice had gone flat. Not angry. Just flat in the way of someone who has run out of willingness to perform patience. I'm doing everything I can for Mom. I'd appreciate if you trusted that. She hung up. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in my hand. And I thought about my mother at 28, buying that house and thinking, this is mine. And I thought about what it meant that her daughter was now sitting behind the curtains while her other daughter knocked, I added to my notes. I called Patricia Okafor the next morning, *. Donna Price has lived next door. To my mother since 1989, she and my mother were not close. Friends in the way of people who vacation together or confide their deepest troubles. They were close in the specific way of women who have lived their adult lives 20 feet apart for 30 years, which is its own particular intimacy. They borrowed eggs. They watched each other's houses during vacations. They waved from driveways. They knew each other's cars, each other's rhythms, each other's lights. On times. Donna is 71 now. She's a retired school administrator, trim and upright and precise in the way of someone who spent decades managing people and information. She has silver hair she wears in a smooth chignon, and she drinks her coffee black, and she does not, she told me, say things she's not sure of. I knocked on her door on a Thursday in June 2019. I hadn't called ahead because I was afraid if I called ahead she would check with Renee first, which told me something about how far gone the situation already was, that I was now operating around my own sister rather than with her. Donna opened the door and looked at me for a moment with a measuring expression and then said, "Nora, come in. I was wondering when you were going to come." We sat at her kitchen table. She had coffee going. She poured me a cup without asking. "How long have you been wondering?" I said, "Since February at least," she said. "Probably longer." She wrapped both hands around her own mug. "I need to know something first. Are you here because you're worried, or are you here because something is already happening legally?" "Both," I said. She nodded. She looked out her kitchen window, which looks directly at my mother's backyard. She'd watched that backyard for 30 years. "Your mother and I have still been having our walks," she said. "Not every week. Your sister has been discouraging it. She says the exertion isn't good for Diane, but Diane calls me sometimes when your sister isn't there, and we walk around the block." She paused. "Your mother is confused sometimes." "She is. She forgets words. She loses track of what she was saying. But she's Diane. When she's having a good spell, she's completely herself. She's sharp. And she knows something is wrong. She just doesn't know exactly what." I asked her to tell me specifically what she'd seen. She told me she'd watched Craig's car in the driveway more times than she could count. Often when Renee wasn't there. She'd watched him carry things in and out of the house, boxes, file folders. Once what appeared to be an accordion folder stuffed thick with papers. She'd noticed the lights on in the basement multiple times. When he was there alone, she'd seen him twice take my mother somewhere in his car when my mother had appeared to be unsteady getting in, not falling. Nothing so obvious, just the careful, uncertain way of someone who isn't completely sure of where they're going. But the most important thing she told me was this.
In March, Donna said.
"I was out back raking leaves, and your mother was in her sunroom. The windows were open. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. But voices carry." She took a sip of coffee, set the mug down carefully. "Craig was in there with her. And I heard him say, and I'm telling you exactly what I heard. He said, 'Diane, we went over this. This is just the updated version. It's the same thing you already agreed to. You just have to sign here.' I felt my hands go cold." "And what did my mother say?" She said, "I thought Gerald handled all of this. Gerald was your father's attorney. I remembered him from the funeral." Donna looked at me steadily. "And Craig said Gerald retired, Diane. We talked about this. This is the new version. Same as before, just updated paperwork. Renee and I handled the transfer. And then it was quiet. I kept raking. I don't know if she signed. I don't know what she signed. But I went home and I wrote it down in my diary. The date and what I'd heard. Because something about it stayed with me." She got up and went to her counter and came back with a small spiral notebook. The kind with the date printed on the cover. One of those dated planners, the kind you can buy at any drugstore. She turned to a page in March and slid it across the table to me. In her neat, precise handwriting. March 14th. Diane in sunroom with CS heard him reference a document. Same thing you already agreed to. Diane confused about attorney. "Something is wrong." I asked if I could photograph the page. She said yes, I asked if she would be willing to speak with an attorney. She said yes. She said she'd been waiting for someone to ask. On my way home, I had to pull over twice. Once because I was crying too hard to see clearly. Once because I needed to sit still for a minute and let the implications of what I just heard settle into my body. Craig had been in my mother's house with documents. He'd been describing those documents as a version of something she'd already agreed to. He'd mentioned a transfer. What had she signed? When? How many times? While she was confused? While she was having a bad day? I called Patricia Okafor from the parking lot of a CVS in Worthington and left her a message that I needed to speak with her as soon as possible. In early July 2019. There was a Saturday when Renee and Craig were both out of town. I know because Renee had told my mother, and my mother had called me, which she still did sometimes, on her own, on her good days, and said, "Nora, Renee's away this weekend. Do you want to come over?" Yes, I wanted to come over. I brought the ingredients for her chicken soup. I brought a plant for her garden, a Russian sage, which she'd always wanted but kept forgetting to get. I brought the most recent issue of the crossword puzzle magazine she liked. The day was warm and clear in the way of Ohio July. That particular blue sky you get before the humidity really sets in. My mother was dressed when I arrived, which I noted with a specific, quiet relief. She was wearing her garden clothes, old canvas pants, a chambray shirt, tennis shoes that had seen a lot of seasons. She met me at the door with a smile that was entirely hers. "You brought the soup things," she said. "You noticed." "I notice everything," she said. "A bit. Mostly." We spent the morning in the garden. I planted the Russian sage while she directed me. "A little further left." "No, your left." "No, there." "Yes." "Good." And then we deadheaded her coneflowers together, which is the kind of mindless, satisfying work that makes it easy to talk about things that matter. She asked about Marcus. I told her we'd broken up in June, which she'd known but kept forgetting. And she said, "I'm sorry, honey," and touched my arm. I asked how she was feeling. She was quiet for a moment. "Some days are hard," she said. She pulled a dead head off a coneflower and considered it. "I can feel something is different. In my head. Like there's a word on the tip of my tongue that I can never quite reach. Except it's not a word. It's a thought. A whole thought. Are you scared?" She considered that for longer than she considered the coneflower. "Not of being confused," she said finally. "I'm scared of not knowing what's happening around me. I'm scared of..." She stopped. "I used to be the person who knew what was happening. In my own house. With my own things." I thought about what to say. I thought about Donna Price's diary. About the gap in the filing cabinet. About Craig saying same thing you already agreed to. "Mom," I said carefully. "Have you signed anything recently? Anything with Craig or Renee?" She looked at me. The direct look, the mother look, the one that was still entirely her even on her worst days. "Renee says I did. She says I agreed to things." She paused. I don't always remember if I agreed or if I just got tired of being asked. Something moved through my chest at that. Something that was part grief and part rage. "What's the difference?" I said, even though I knew. "The difference," she said, "is whether it was my decision." She went back to deadheading, methodically, a little more aggressively than the flowers strictly required. "I think I made some decisions that weren't really mine. She stopped again. "I think some things happened while I was having a bad day." We stayed in the garden until lunch. Then we made the soup together, her guiding me through the parts of the recipe she still held clearly. Me doing the parts she asked me to handle. We ate at the kitchen table, the same table she'd had since 1989. With the same blue placemats. She did the crossword after lunch. She got more than half of it before she set it down. "I'll finish it later," she said. "Of course." She looked at her hands. "I want you to know something, Nora. Whatever happened, whatever I signed, I know what I meant. I always meant the same thing. 50-50. That's what your father and I agreed. That's what I've always meant. I know, Mom. She looked up. Do something about it? I'm going to, I said. I stayed until 6. I washed the soup pot while she dozed in the armchair in the living room. I watched her sleep for a moment before I left. The steady rise and fall of her chest, her hands loose in her lap. Her face as familiar to me as anything I'd ever known. I locked the door when I left, and sat in my car for a long time. That was the last really good day. There were other days after that, days when she was present and herself in flashes. But that Saturday, that soup, that garden, that crossword, that last direct look, was the last day that felt entirely like the mother I'd grown up with. I had no way of knowing that at the time. You never do. My mother passed away on September 3rd, 2019. Not unexpectedly. The mild cognitive impairment had been accompanied. It turned out by a condition her actual cardiologist, not Dr. Moran, who I now suspected was in Renee and Craig's orbit, had flagged in July. Her heart was not good. It had not been good for some time. This had not been communicated to me. She died at home in the early morning. Renee was there. I was not called until after, I don't know how long after. My phone showed the call at 7:12 m.m., and Renee said she'd been gone for about an hour. Whether that's true, I have chosen not to investigate. Because some things you have to leave alone if you want to survive them. I drove to the house on Grayfield Lane in a state I can only describe as gray, not numb exactly. Not yet fully feeling, just muted, the way sound mutes when you go underwater. I remember the drive, but not in detail. I remember the light being wrong for morning, too flat, too even. Renee met me at the door. She was composed. She was wearing a blazer, which struck me as strange. It was 7:30 in the morning. She'd been there all night presumably, but she was wearing a blazer, and her hair was neat. I thought about that blazer for weeks. We held each other for a moment. We cried. That part was real. The paramedics had already been. The rest of the morning was administrative in the particular. Shocking way of death, phone calls, decisions. The strange bureaucracy of loss. It was 2 days later that I found the blue folder. Renee had gone home. We had agreed to come back to the house together on Saturday to begin the process of sorting through things, but I drove over on Thursday evening alone. I told myself I needed to be in the house. I needed to sit with it before the dismantling began. I sat in my mother's living room for a while. Then I went to the basement. I told myself I was just looking at the garden tools, figuring out what to do with them. But I went to the filing cabinet. I went to the bottom drawer. It was different than it had been in April. More folders now, pushed together. And in the front of the drawer, a blue folder I hadn't seen before. I pulled it out. Inside, a document titled, Amendment to Last Will and Testament of Diane Carroll Hutchins. Dated January 14th, 2019. A codicil. Drafted not by Gerald Pitts, who had retired, but by an attorney named P.K. Reeves, whose office address was listed as 4800 Reed Road, Columbus, Ohio. I sat down on the basement floor. I sat there for a moment and breathed. Then I read it, the codicil amended. My mother's 2011 will in 2 places. First, the house on Grayfield Lane was bequeathed entirely to Renee Stafford, rather than split equally between Renee and me. Second, the contents of the household, including all personal items, furniture, household goods, and related contents, were similarly transferred to Renee Stafford in full. My share of the estate was, by this document, the retirement accounts and CDs only, which, at the time of my mother's death, totaled approximately $86,000 after the fees and penalties of any early disbursement. The house was worth, at that point, approximately $225,000, Renee's total share. By this document, the house, its contents, and her half of the retirement accounts, roughly $250,000. My total share, roughly $86,000, but that's not the part that made me sit on the concrete floor of my mother's basement and press my hand flat against the cold floor and try to breathe. The signature was the part. At the bottom of the document, in the signature line, Diane Carroll Hutchins, in my mother's handwriting, or something very close to it. Except I knew my mother's handwriting. I had grown up with her handwriting on birthday cards and grocery lists and notes packed in school lunches. I had her handwriting on 40 years of Christmas cards. I knew the way she crossed her capital H with a small backward flourish that she'd had since high school. She told me once. And that none of her children had inherited. The H in Hutchins on this document did not have the flourish. Asterisk. It was otherwise very good. Someone had looked carefully at my mother's signature. Someone had practiced, but they'd missed the H I did not confront. Renee, I know some of you reading this would have, and I understand that impulse completely. I've thought about what I would have done differently, and confronting her directly is the one thing I'm glad I didn't do. Because I'll explain why in a moment. Instead, I photographed every page of that blue folder. I put it back in the drawer. I went home. I called Patricia Okafor at 8 o'clock the next morning. I found it, I said when she answered. Tell me everything. I told her about the codicil. About the date, January 2019, which would have been during the period when my mother had been newly diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, and, Craig had been in the house multiple times a week. About the attorney listed, P.K. Reeves on Reed Road. About the signature. About the H asterisk. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Don't touch the document again, she said. Leave it exactly where it is. Don't tell Renee you've seen it. Why? Because if she knows you've seen it, and she knows what you're looking for, she will either destroy it or get ahead of this legally. Right now she believes she is operating from a position of complete control. That's what we need her to believe for a few more days. I asked what we were going to do. We're going to contest the codicil, she said. On the grounds of undue influence and possible document fraud. We're going to subpoena the attorney who drafted it. We're going to get a forensic handwriting examiner to look at that signature. And we're going to do this as fast as possible because probate is going to be initiated shortly and we need to be in position before the estate is distributed. We met in her office the following Monday. She had me bring my mother's original Christmas cards, 12 years of them. A stack of envelopes I'd had in my own filing cabinet, each one in my mother's handwriting. Each one with the backward flourished H. I also brought Donna Price, who had agreed without hesitation. Patricia Okafor was, in person, a small woman with enormous glasses and a stillness that felt like a kind of power. The stillness of someone who had been in many rooms with people who were afraid and had learned that stillness is the most useful thing. She shook my hand. She shook Donna's hand. She looked at the Christmas cards. Good, she said, which felt, in that moment, like the most reassuring word I'd ever heard. We filed a caveat, a formal objection to the probate of the amended will, within the week. We served notice to Renee. The confrontation I'd avoided came anyway, of course. 2 days after we filed, Renee called me, and her voice had that particular flatness that I now recognized as the sound of someone whose mask had been disturbed. What are you doing? She said. I'm protecting Mom's estate, I said. The way I should have been doing all along. You're contesting a legally executed document. I'm contesting a document I believe was executed under duress, during a period of documented cognitive impairment, by an attorney whose relationship to you and Craig I am very interested in. Silence. You're going to regret this, she said. Maybe, I said. But I'm going to do it anyway. She hung up, and I sat at my kitchen table and felt, for the first time in months, like someone who was actually moving instead of being moved. Asterisk, what followed was 14 months of the most exhausting, financially draining, emotionally destabilizing experience of my life. And I want to be clear about that because I've seen these stories told where the fight is energizing, where the righteousness of it carries the protagonist through. That is not how it was. There were weeks where I worked my full schedule at the dental practice and then came home and spent 4 or 6 hours on the phone or reviewing documents or responding to the discovery request that Renee's attorney, a man named David Fike, who had the polished Unreadable face of someone paid to have no actual opinions, kept submitting. There were nights I couldn't sleep not because of the drama of it but because of the sheer accumulation of detail, the documents. The dates, the arguments, the gaps. Patricia had told me from the beginning, this is going to cost money. I had savings, the end of things with Marcus mercifully had left me financially intact if not emotionally, and I spent most of them. By month 6 I had spent $42,000 in legal fees. By month 12 it was $68,000. I will not pretend that number didn't sometimes make me want to quit. There were 3 specific times that I almost did. The first was in November 2019, about 6 weeks after we'd filed the caveat. Patricia had submitted a subpoena to P.K. Reeves, the attorney who drafted the codicil. He had, it turned out, closed his practice in July 2019, 2 months before my mother died, and moved to Florida. Serving him was complicated. Dealing with his responses was more complicated. And in the middle of all of this, Patricia called me to say that Renee's attorney had filed a motion claiming that I was contesting the will for financial gain and had made no credible showing of fraud. That's what they always argue first, Patricia said. It's routine. But you need to know they'll keep filing motions like this. They are trying to exhaust your resources and your energy. That is a conscious strategy. I know, I said. Do you want to keep going? There was a pause on the line during which I thought about my mother saying, I think some things happened while I was having a bad day. Yes, I said. I want to keep going. The second time was in March 2020, COVID. The court slowed. Hearings got postponed. Our forensic handwriting examiner, a woman named Dr. Lynn Park at Ohio State, who had been hired at considerable expense, completed her analysis, but we couldn't get it in front of a judge for months. Dr. Park's analysis, when I read it, was careful and specific in the way of expert testimony designed to hold up in court. She noted 27 characteristics of my mother's authentic signature across 22 sample documents spanning 12 years. She noted that the signature on the codicil matched in 17 of those characteristics and diverged in 10. She identified the H as the clearest point of divergence but not the only one. Her conclusion, stated with the measured language of her profession, was that the signature on the January 14, 2019 codicil presented significant questions of authenticity and was inconsistent with the verified signature profile of Diane Carroll Hutchins in ways not attributable to normal variation due to aging or cognitive change. Significant questions. That's as close as forensic document examiners get to saying, somebody faked this, the third time. I almost quit was in August 2020, when Craig submitted a written declaration stating that my mother had been of sound mind on the day the codicil was signed and that he had been present during the process and had witnessed her signing willingly. He described the appointment with P.K. Reeves in detail. He described my mother as clear, oriented, and decisive. He also claimed that he had not, as I alleged, been in the basement of my mother's house removing documents, and that any suggestion of this was fabricated. I sat with that declaration for a night. The specific wrongness of it, someone describing a scene in clinical, credible terms that you know did not happen the way they're describing, is a particular kind of gaslight. And I felt it land on me even though I knew exactly what he was doing. Then I sent Patricia the photos I'd taken of the filing cabinet in April 2019, the gap in the folders, the dust marks, the date stamp on the photos. She read them and called me within the hour. You have been very careful, she said, with a warmth that suggested she did not take that for granted. Asterisk. We deposed Craig in September 2020. I sat in a conference room on the 8th floor of a building on Broad Street and watched him answer questions for 4 hours. And I will tell you that the thing about watching someone lie skillfully under oath is that you can see the precise moment they realize a question is going somewhere they didn't anticipate, and they have to quickly decide whether to continue the lie or begin the partial retreat. He was good. But the photos of the filing cabinet, combined with phone records Patricia had subpoenaed showing the number of calls between Craig and P.K. Reeves in the weeks before the codicil was dated, 17 calls in 10 days. which is not a number consistent with a routine estate planning appointment initiated by the client, had produced a version of the events that his careful, credible description could not entirely account for. We deposed P.K. Reeves in November via video link from his residence in Sarasota. He was cooperative in the way of someone who had decided that cooperation was now in his best interest, which suggested that Patricia had communicated something to his attorney that had affected this calculation. He acknowledged that Craig Stafford had contacted him, not Diane Hutchins. He acknowledged that the appointment in January had been scheduled by Renee Stafford. He acknowledged that my mother had been present but that he had been told she had been fully briefed on the changes and was in agreement. He acknowledged that Craig had been in the room during the signing. He did not acknowledge forging the signature. He maintained that he had witnessed Diane Hutchins sign the document. But when Patricia asked him carefully and specifically about the handwriting examination report she placed in front of him, he looked at it for a long time before he said, "I can only tell you what I observed," which is not the same as saying she signed it. And he knew that the case settled in November 2020, not a full trial. Renee's attorney, in the third week of November, called Patricia and made an offer. I want to be precise about why they settled because I think it matters. By November, we had Dr. Park's handwriting analysis, the phone records showing the Craig to Reeves calls, Donna Price's signed statement and her diary entry, my dated photos of the filing cabinet, Craig's deposition, which contained 3 answers that contradicted his own written declaration, P.K. Reeves's deposition, which was, at minimum, significantly unhelpful to Renee and Craig's position, and we had filed a complaint with the Ohio State Bar Association regarding P.K. Reeves's conduct, which had initiated a separate investigation that Renee and Craig's attorney had become very interested in making go away. The offer was as follows. The house would be sold. The proceeds would be split, 60% to Renee, 40% to me. The contents of the house would be divided as I saw fit. The retirement accounts would be split 50-50. As per the original 2011 will. It was not 50-50. It was not what my mother had intended. It was not what I would have won if we'd gone to trial and won completely. Patricia laid it out for me very directly. We might win at trial. We might also lose, not because we were wrong, but because document fraud cases are hard and juries are complicated. Even if we won, the appeals process could extend this another 2-3 years. My legal fees were now approaching $70,000. Whatever I won at trial would be partially consumed by those fees. If you take this settlement, she said, you receive approximately $92,000 from the house sale, $43,000 from the retirement account split, and the contents of the house, which include some items of financial and significant personal value. Total, somewhere between $135,000 and $150,000, depending on the market. And if I reject it, then we go to trial, and you might win more, and you might win the same, and you might lose. And we go another year at least, and you spend more on fees. I thought about my mother in the garden on that last Good Saturday. She'd looked at her hands and said, "Whatever happened, whatever I signed, I know what I meant. I took the settlement. I want to be honest about how that felt." It did not feel like victory. It felt like the difference between what should have happened and what did happen, a gap of $60,000 or $80,000 and 3 years of my life, and something harder to measure than money. The justice of it was partial. The wrong had been done, and the settlement acknowledged the wrong without fully correcting it. But I had my mother's kitchen table, her crossword puzzle magazines, her garden tools, every Christmas card she'd ever sent, in my handwriting drawer where she'd always put them, her jewelry, her books, the photograph album from 1978 that showed her and my father the day they'd signed the papers on the house on Grayfield Lane. I had those things. Renee got a larger check. I've thought about that trade many times, and I keep arriving at the same place. I chose correctly, Renee, and I have not spoken since the settlement was finalized. I've thought about this more than I expected to. Not because I miss her, I'm not sure what I miss, if anything. Because the person I thought she was for most of my life was, it turns out, a more complicated person than I understood. I think about it because of the finality of it. The way you cross a line in family disputes that is simply uncrossable in the other direction. We are sisters. We will remain sisters in the technical sense. We will not, I believe, speak again in any meaningful way. Her children, Mason, who's 16 now, and Lily, who's 13, I have thought about a great deal. They are not responsible for what their parents did. But they are, at present, the children of my sister, and I don't know how to hold that with any grace. I sent them birthday cards in the first year. I stopped after that. Craig, I need to tell you about Craig. P.K. Reeves was disbarred. Not solely because of our case. By the time the Bar Association's investigation was complete, it emerged that Reeves had been involved in at minimum 3 other cases with patterns similar to what had happened with my mother. Elderly clients, cognitive impairment, codicils drafted under circumstances that were not initiated by the clients themselves. He was disbarred in March 2021. Craig was not criminally charged. Patricia was direct with me about why. The document fraud was difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal context. The criminal standard being higher than the civil. And the evidence, while sufficient for our settlement, was not, in the prosecutor's assessment, sufficient for a conviction. She filed a report with the Columbus police. They opened a file. As of when I'm telling you this story, nothing has happened with it. I find this difficult to accept. I want to be honest about that. Craig Stafford drove to my mother's house many times over the course of a year and a half. During the period when she was confused and frightened and losing her grip on herself. And he sat at her table and he handed her documents and he told her they were the same thing she'd already agreed to. Whether he wrote her signature himself or whether he coached and pressured her to sign something in a moment when she didn't fully understand what she was signing. I believe one of those 2 things happened. And either one is a crime in any meaningful moral sense of that word. He lives in the same house in Columbus. He drives the same Audi. He still sells insurance. I am trying to make peace with the fact that the legal system processed this and produced a partial result, and that there are things the law cannot fully reach. I'm not there yet. My own life has changed in specific ways. I moved to a smaller apartment in 2020, cheaper rent, saving money and then used part of the settlement to buy a condo in Clintonville in 2021, a 2nd floor unit with a small balcony, where I've been growing things in pots, basil, Russian sage, coneflowers that I take inside in the winter. I have a garden that comes back. I went back to see Patricia in the spring of 2021. Not for legal business, just to thank her. She was in the middle of another case, another family, another set of documents. She walked me to the door and said, "You did what needed doing." I think about that sometimes. Not as praise, just as a fact. It needed doing, and I did it. The house on Grayfield Lane was sold in April 2021. After 11 months on the market. A young couple bought it. They have a toddler. I drove by once about 6 months after they moved in, and the garden, which had been allowed to go to seed through the legal process, was beginning to be managed again. I could see the coneflowers coming back. In my mother's writing, the capital H in Hutchins had a small backward flourish. A curl that went left instead of right at the top of the second upstroke. She'd had it since high school. She'd told me once, laughing, that she'd learned it wrong and couldn't unlearn it, and eventually decided she didn't want to. I have a Christmas card from 1996 on my desk right now. She wrote, "Merry Christmas to my Nora. With love forever, Mom, Diane Hutchins." And there's the H with its little backward flourish. Identical to every H she wrote for 50 years, the signature on the codicil was good. It really was. Someone had worked hard on it. They'd studied it. They'd gotten the loops right, the slant, the pressure of her pen. But the H didn't have the flourish. Dr. Park identified it in her report, along with 9 other divergences. But that's the one I keep coming back to. Because whoever forged my mother's signature, whether it was Craig himself or someone he paid, Or something even worse that I haven't fully let myself think about. That person didn't know her well enough to know. About the age, they knew her signature from a distance. From observation. From looking at documents. They did not know it the way you know someone's handwriting when you've been receiving their letters. Your whole life, that is the difference between studying a person and knowing them. Between extracting what you need from someone and actually loving them. My mother knew every detail of our handwriting, mine and Renee's. She could have identified either of our signatures in the dark. That was who she was. A woman who paid attention to the people she loved. The H is what saved us. The H is what Dr. Park found. The H is what made the phone records and the depositions and the filing. Cabinet photographs cohere into something that could not be ignored. She didn't know it. But my mother protected herself from a long way away. She protected herself by being exactly who she was, for long enough that the mark of it was on every document she'd ever signed, clear as a fingerprint. I keep the 1996 Christmas card on my desk. It's a little faded and the edges are soft from handling. But the H is right there. That's mine. That one is mine. Asterisk if you've been watching this all the way through. Thank you. I know that's a long time to sit with someone's grief and anger. And I don't take that lightly. I want to say something practical for anyone who is in the middle of what I was in the beginning. The part where something feels wrong, but you can't name it exactly. Trust that feeling. Trust it earlier than I did. Get an elder law attorney before you think you need one. Know where your parents' estate documents are. Know who their attorney is. Know the terms of any power of attorney that's been established. And if you don't know, find out. Cognitive impairment, when it comes, creates a window. And there are people who understand exactly how to use that window. I wish I hadn't had to learn that the hard way. I also want to say, and this is harder to say, that the ending of this story is not what I wanted. I wanted full justice. I wanted the exact wrong to be fully corrected. What I got was partial justice and a settlement, and the knowledge that Craig Stafford is still out there selling insurance. That's the truth of it. Some of you are going to fight your own versions of this, and you're going to win something partial, and you're going to have to decide whether partial is enough. I can't tell you how to answer that. I can tell you that the fight was worth it, not because of the money, but because I kept my word to my mother. I said I was going to do something about it. I did. She would have done the same for me. If you have a story, a family dispute, a will you believe was manipulated, something that happened to your parents that you've been sitting on, I want to hear about it in the comments. Not because I can give you legal advice. I can't. Please get an actual attorney. But because these stories live in people's bodies for years, and sometimes the first thing you need to do is say it out loud. I'll be reading if this story reached you. Please like, share, and subscribe. New episodes every week. And tell someone who needs to hear it. Take care of your people while you still can.